Hello everyone. A quick introduction for myself and others before we get into our incredible speakers for today. So my name is Si Zhu, a PhD student in UMD's College of Information and coordinator for this year's Authors Speaker Series. A little information about us. Authors is an organizational teams and technology research society, a network of scholars across the DC area dedicated to researching and learning anything and everything to do with teams and technology. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Professor Janet Vertesi, an associate professor of sociology at the Princeton University. She is also associate director of the Keller Center of Innovation in Engineering Education. Her current focus is on building a societally responsible design program at Princeton and serves as an advisory board member for the Data and Society Institute and Electronic Privacy Information Center. Um, yeah, so take it away, Professor Versi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. You may have noticed my title has changed, and that's largely because when I gave you the title before, I was thinking about how my work fits into thinking about the future of human AI collaboration. And as I thought more about it, I thought actually that really is the story of this talk. And so I wanted to make sure that the material I was giving you was oriented towards, I think, what is the most important findings from my 2 decades of working with NASA's robotic spacecraft teams for understanding the future of human AI collaboration. So for those of you that came expecting an earlier version of the talk, don't worry, all of that material is still here. But I think this speaks more broadly to provocations for how we might both study and additionally craft responsible human AI systems. So there's a lot of excitement right now about AI and the future of AI, whether it's in the stock market or science fiction or little GPTs that have shown up on our desktops all over the world. Everyone seems to have an opinion about what's coming next and why we must rush to build the future right now. And I find that this narrative of what AI is and what our human, automated, and robotic future looks like is largely being predetermined by a series of inputs. And some of those inputs are pretty limited. I mean, we have the materials from science fiction. For instance, these robots as jocular, autonomous companions. We have the idea that they might be eerily unsettling intelligences that replace our human companionship. We also have the idea that they are really quite creepy and not totally understandable in their motivations. And then, of course, there are some motivations that are understandable that we're really quite worried about. So, but even in all of this, despite these different science fiction ideas, and I want to make sure, oh, and there is an AI assistant taking notes for this very meeting. She's noticed it in the chat. Even in all of these imaginaries of what AI is and what it could be, we are going to tremendous lengths and resource extraction to make this possible. So the question is almost like, what will we do to try to get there, and what resources are we willing to burn along the way? But I'd really like to take a step back and decenter a lot of the myths and narratives that are coming from for-profit centers, from corporations, and their funding of academic units. And because this is producing a certain narrative about what AI is and what it has to be and what it should look like. But it's not the only way forward. And in fact, it's not at all representative of what we're already seeing with complex human robot and human artificially augmented teams. So to that extent, what I want to do today is kind of clear those assumptions by presenting my work from over 2 decades with NASA's robotic spacecraft teams. And as a sociologist and a person coming from science and technology studies and from human-computer interaction, I've been behind the scenes on some of the most successful missions that NASA has launched in the last 20 years. Both observing them in the context of operations and then also observing them trying to get off the ground and get built in the first place. And what I've found is that, I've been working for 20 years with people whose work is imbricated with mixed autonomous kinds of systems. They're artificially intelligent systems. They have various degrees of onboard autonomy, but these are people who live and work with robots every single day. And they have something to teach us about what the future of AI and human collaboration actually looks like or could look like. So in this talk, I'm going to draw on 2 decades of field work. I'm going to spend the first half of the talk focusing on my work with these first 2 missions that I did over the first decade of field work, the Mars exploration rovers and the Cassini mission to Saturn, which formed the foundation of my first and second books. But I'll also draw on work that I did with other spacecraft teams, for instance, the Interstellar Probe team, as well as the Europa Clipper mission, which just launched about a year ago today and is on its way to Jupiter. And in doing this, I'm going to be speaking across a lot of this literature, as well as additional work that I've published in the story of automation. And so you'll find references to mostly these first 2 books, and most of the talk talks about the second book, Shaping Science. Although I'll note that a third one is on its way, and I'll be speaking more provocatively to the lessons that come from that towards the end of the talk. But thinking about this time that I've spent at NASA, I've been thinking about what should we as scholars be attending to when we look at these human robot teams? And additionally, how should we be building for the future of human robot and human AI interaction, whether or not those artificial intelligences are embodied or merely computational and distributed agents? We need to be thinking about what's currently happening to re-envision what's possible. And so to a large extent, what I'm giving you today is a critical design provocation. But unlike a lot of critical design right now, which is mostly based on speculative design, this is based on what's actually happening and ways that humans and robots can and do live and work together. So here are my 10 provocations that come from my fieldwork for the way that we should study and construct human AI teams. First, all AI is mixed autonomy. Second, machines are always part of a team, and the way that team is organized has tremendous downstream implications for the kinds of work that they do and the relationships that they have with their robots. I will also discuss how anthropomorphism and robotic relations are emergent from the context of this team's organization. They're not design decisions built directly into the robots. And I'll explain how we can think about data sovereignty within the context of human AI relations that respects human and robotic relationships. I'm going to spend the majority of the talk on that component, which is based on the first 2 books. But then I'm going to discuss a couple of other important implications for how we're currently thinking about the study and construction of teams, thinking about on-the-box AI and robotic interactions, planning against obsolescence instead of for it, thinking about the economics behind these systems, whether it's money or science, how regulation shapes a system, whether or not we think it's present, how the future we're building towards almost never comes to be, and how we need to reconceptualize knowledge when we think about artificial intelligence. So let me jump right in by saying, first of all AI, whenever we're talking about AI, humans are in the mix somewhere. Now, with LLMs, we're used to thinking about the ghost work that's done by offshore groups in the Philippines or in Mexico or in the global south, in which invisible humans are making the machinery appear to work seamlessly in front of our eyes. What's interesting about NASA is that every time we look at these robots, we think that the exploration is happening by these robots, but it's not. It's actually the robots are an extension of a large and distributed team of experts on Earth. Hundreds of scientists and engineers who work together, look at what the robot is doing every day, and determine what the robot should do the next day. Now, this isn't a problem to be solved. This is a solution to the problem of how we explore other planets. And it's a solution because what it does is it leverages the distinct intelligences of humans and machines and leverages that for better capacity in doing science. And it also leverages the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration and allows people to come in as experts from their respective fields. So anytime you look at these beautiful images that come back from Mars or Saturn or Jupiter or whatever, this is the result of mixed human-robot interactions that takes into account what humans are good at and what machines are good at and builds synergies from there. So this is not a project of replacement. It is a project of extension and collaboration. One way that we see this, and I talked about this extensively in Seeing Like a Rover, is that the robot can do things that humans can't. I mean, for one thing, the robot can go places that we can't. It can orbit Mars or Jupiter or Europa or Enceladus. It can conduct science in those places where we can't go. Our bodies are not outfitted for those activities in space, whether on planets or in space. But additionally, the robot may have sensibilities that we don't have. So, especially when working with the rovers, this is a picture of soil on Mars that's taken through multiple filters that the robot's panoramic camera eyes have. And the scientists I spoke to were like, look, we don't want human eyes on Mars. You can't see anything that way. Our eyes are built for Earth. And so we see in our rods and cones and our sensibility to red, green, and blue is dependent on earthbound conditions. Mars just looks red to us. We get it. Seeing more red Mars doesn't tell us anything about what the different parts are made of. But when you put these different filters of camera lenses together, then you can actually learn something new. You can see that this turfed up bit of soil is actually made of really different materials. So you need the robots unique capabilities, non-human capabilities to do that. And what's interesting about this phenomenon in particular is that the human knowledge is valuable. The robot doesn't look at that and be like, oh, okay, I did the science now. The robot returns those images that then get discussed extensively on Earth and then determine what the robot should take next in order to sort out, are we seeing the site of a hot spring? Is this something that could be found by wind? Is this a deposit from something else? Those are multiple different hypotheses the humans are working with. So the humans are valuable as creative interpreters and interlocutors with the robotic capabilities. And this is especially visible because when it comes to Mars, replacement is out of the question, right? We can't go to Mars. It's not just that we don't have the capability of getting there and getting back. It's just that we know we're going to die within 3 minutes of being on the Martian surface. We just don't know if that's because our blood will boil from radiation, if our bodies will freeze from the cold, or if we'll die of asphyxiation first. But we know we basically have 3 minutes, right? So the robot is not taking our jobs. The robot is making our jobs possible and making exploration possible. And that means that that future of human AI synergy and collaboration is an entirely different kind of proposition. Now, I mentioned that this is a collaboration, and what that means is it's always part of a team. The machinery is an extension of, but also a participant in a socially organized community of scientists and engineers on Earth. And that organization is really important because, as I argue in my second book, Shaping Science, how the team is organized matters tremendously for a whole series of organizational outcomes. Now, I showed you at the outset all of those different missions I've worked on. Those mission teams involve many of the same people and the same institutions. What I'm going to talk to you about right now is about 2 missions that were concurrent, and they had overlapping rosters of personnel and institutions. But they each chose really different ways of working together in order to solve the local problems that they had to solve scientifically. Now, I want to bring organizations into the equation and make that very explicit, although I might be preaching to the choir with this group in particular, because we often think of LLMs and even co-robotics in very small groups or in dyads. We think about human robot and human machine communication as a question of one-to-one interaction, or maybe there's multiple robots, like little, robots going out there to, save people in the rubble or something that are being commanded by some human with their finger on the button. There's no one person with a finger on the button when you're working on another planet. Instead, there are considerable, large, and distributed teams. And this draws our attention to how we interact when we do science, when we do any group or major activity. We do it in groups and we do it in teams. And those teams are organized in different ways. So for robotic spacecraft teams, they bring together an interdisciplinary group of experts who are specially selected because they're the top of their fields to study the planet. Now, the robot that we send is a very limited resource. It's only going to be alive for so long. When we build it and then send it out into the outer solar system, if you build something that launches in 1997, it's outfitted with like 386 processors, and you have to keep working with it until 2017. So you're not working with top of the line stuff. The robots only have so much onboard memory and power, and they only turn to phone home once or twice a day. And you're only going to visit this object once. So you have very, very limited resources. I often talk about this like being on a bus with like 350 of your friends, but everyone's an expert in something different, and there's only one steering wheel, and they all want to go somewhere different. So what happens is each team comes up with a local way of making decisions. The team decides how they're going to decide what it is they're going to prioritize, what they're going to visit, and what science they're going to do. And everything those spacecraft do is dependent upon that local micropolitics of decision making on Earth. Now, I can almost hear the computer scientists among you, or people that are really into algorithms, being like, well, this is just an optimization problem. Surely an algorithm can figure out what the right configuration is of experts and scientific topics and disciplines that need to be arranged. And some people have tried to do this in the past to impoverished outcomes, because this isn't an optimization problem. This is a governance question. This is a question of how we together collectively combine our expertise to decide what is the best possible thing we can do with this asset, with this robotic vehicle right now. So reframing this from optimization to governance, in which the robot plays a role in responsible governance, is an enormous shift. And every team needs to have the right to make their decisions their own way. So for instance, this team that I studied that operated 2 robots on the surface of Mars, they chose a charismatic collective. They made every single one of their decisions by consensus. So they would meet once a day to decide, look at the data that came down from the robot the day before, and decide what it was they were going to do the next day. And those meetings were described as like, you want, out at the end of the meeting, you don't just want to plan for what the robot's going to do tomorrow that we're going to code and send up to the robot. You want everyone to have a sense of ownership over the plan. That means that we all collectively have to constantly be working together to determine the right collection of expertises and instruments for the robot to deploy. The robot was conceptualized like a Swiss Army knife with multiple different instruments, and anyone could use all of those instruments to solve a problem. This is very important. If you're a robot on another planet and you're looking at, say, a rock in front of you, you want to understand that rock from as many different angles as possible. And that was the whole principle behind this kind of mission, which was largely staffed by geologists, geochemists, and people that were interested in surface processes on Mars. And at the end of the meeting, after every meeting, they would go around the room and say, are you happy with the plan? And everyone would have to say, yes, I'm happy, before they proceed. And you should try this at your next faculty meeting. Actually, you shouldn't try this at your next faculty meeting, because you can't just walk in and say, is everyone happy? You have to have an entire culture and structure of an organization that's oriented towards making sure that everyone starts on the same page and ends on the same page, and that all of your organizational processes are oriented towards making sure the consensus happens so you can move forward. But that's really different than what this team did at exactly the same time on the other side of the asteroid belt, exploring the Saturn system with its many different moons and its rings and its aurora and its magnetic field. This was a highly interdisciplinary mission that involved scientists from all over the world, including from the European Union and the United States. So this team needed to privilege sub-team autonomy. They needed to make sure that the instruments didn't necessarily all work together, but that everyone had control over their own instrument and their own way of doing science. And they chose a matrix organization to do this. And they fiercely defended each subgroup's ability to make their own decisions. This was described to me as like the United States. Every instrument, every team has their own state. They all do it a little bit differently. And that's really important for the integrity of their science. Another then described that when you go into the meetings, it's not like you want a sense of ownership. Instead, it's like Congress. Sometimes you're making friends with these guys to make sure an observation gets through. Sometimes you're making friends with those guys. Sometimes you're arguing really forcefully on the floor. But regardless, the issue of putting together a plan for robotic activities was one of juggling very high priorities among extremely distinct kinds of science. And in order to make sure that the right kind of science was being done and the top priority science was really coming out, was a question of governance, was a question of making sure this team could communicate effectively. And they would say things like, we can't make everyone happy, but we can make everyone equally unhappy. which especially compared to the other team, it sounds like this is problematic, but actually the key here is equally. The main thing that they were trying to do was make sure that there was a fair and equal allocation of resources at the end of the day. Of course, every sub-team had their own way of deciding what was equal and what was fair, but regardless, they defended the autonomy of each group to make their own decisions as appropriate for them. Now, this ended up meaning that the organizations optimized for really different types of investigations. The rover team was able to approach particular kinds of rocks or soil and use it with all of the different instruments. They would call it hit it with everything we've got, make sure everybody is together on this plan. Whereas the Saturn instruments were much better at detecting, say, changes over time or having a singular instrumental view through something like the rings over different seasons. And here we might then update Karen Norsatina's idea that the sciences have different epistemic cultures to think about how organizations produce their own epistemic cultures, and that the organizational parameters are essential to understanding the kind of knowledge that emerges. And in fact, they do produce very, very different kinds of knowledge. So the organizational choices on each team shape the outcomes. These are co-publication networks that we organize based on the outcomes of these teams. On the left, you see the rover team, in which the conversation was always about whatever we decide together is what's best for the science. The distance between author nodes is a little over 1. The teams are highly interconnected, even when they bring in different disciplinary expertise. And we performed a between centrality analysis, and the PI wasn't even the most central node. These were people that managed different kinds of instruments that were busy synergizing across instruments. Meanwhile, on the right, you see a classic image of the kind of team that the mission going to Saturn was, in which the computer has perfectly identified the distinct instrument teams and the few linkages between them. And this really diagrams out the way that they approached their science, which is to say that they didn't think it was a good idea if everyone got together and said, let's agree not to disagree. They were not in favor of consensus. They were in favor of making sure that there was dissent, and there were many different ideas that were made possible through their robot. So what's interesting here is that these are human machine organizations. It's not just the people doing this. The machinery is participating, and they participate in each organization's very unique form of distributed cognition. So when we look at human AI teams outside of, say, NASA, we need to take into account the distinct organizational configurations of those teams, because that's going to predict the kind of outcomes that we have with respect to the robots and their partnerships and interactions, as well as other outcomes of the team. And let me demonstrate how this really matters for the way we interact with robots. We tend to think of the way we feel about these robots as contingent on how the robot is designed. So this is why we spend a lot of time thinking about anthropomorphism, about creating joyful kinds of experiences, the kind of sycophancy that we've now developed into our LLMs, in which we want people to feel happy whenever they're interacting with these robots. But remember that happiness on that rover team was not about interacting with the robots, it was about interacting with the team. And that's the key thing I want to get across with this point, is that anthropomorphism, the way that we feel about these technical components of our teams, is contingent on the organization of the team and not on the form of the robot or the artificial agent. This was very visible in what I call a form of techno-solidarity, which is that the robot relations arise from the organizational form. So here I'm going to, riff on Emil Durkheim, who's a foundational sociologist, who says that basically the form of the society's organization of labor, predicts the way that people feel about each other, the form of its social solidarity. And he often said, the family doesn't do things for each other because they love each other. The family loves each other because they do things for each other. So the organization of the work produces a form of sentiment. This was very powerful on that rover team, where people would turn their bodies into the robot, as you can see with this person here, feel and experience vicariously what was going on Mars through the robotic body, would describe how, I broke my toe salsa dancing at the same time as the rover's wheel broke. Or for some reason, my right wrist just seized up while I was gardening. And it was the same time as the robot was having trouble on Mars. So that kind of affective relationship between the humans and machines, on the one hand, was the humans narrating their experience through the machines. but on the other hand, really arose from the conditions of solidarity on the strong collective in which the robot became a kind of team totem. So, as one participant described, the hardware, the robot, is the glue. It binds the team together. And once the robots leave Earth, the team is all we've got left. So, in this case, the strong social solidarity effects of the team as a collective that were oriented towards consensus were projected onto the robot as a member of that collective and an expression of the kind of body politic of the team. Now, meanwhile, on Saturn, they were like, these guys on Mars, like we don't understand it because the emotional attachment we have isn't to the machine. The machine doesn't represent what we're doing. We have all these relationships with the scientists that we're interacting with. We're trying to do good science. And these members of the team would extend the robot as far from their body as possible when they embodied it. So they used the right-hand rule from physics to basically determine how is the robot pointed as it's moving around in the Saturn system, and therefore which instruments can observe at which times based on where the instruments are pointing. And they would have software as well as, embodied ways of getting at this. This woman here on the right is demonstrating a kind of cardboard cutout she made that shows how, if you rotate it around the pen, all the different instruments and where they're pointing are moving. And so these extensions, these embodiments, expressed the machine as a kind of socio-technical calculator. Remember that for this team, the most important thing was that it was equal, that it was fair at the end of the day. So this wasn't just a question of which way is the robot pointing. It was, if we put this plan together, is it both a thing the robot can execute in terms of where it's pointing, and will it produce the kind of fairness that we express here? The key thing to notice is that both of these orientations, these techno-solidarity orientations, are in alignment with the way that the team organizes the labor. One towards the collectivity, the other towards independence and autonomy and making sure that polyvocalism is respected. And yet both teams talked about this as if it was just a property of the robot. They would say, well, you couldn't do this any other way. Like, if you have rovers, you have to do it this way. If you have an orbiter, you have to do it this way. This is just obvious. So since then, we have flown rovers organized like the Saturn team, and we have flown orbiters organized like the rover team. And the sentiment towards the vehicle is entirely predicted by the organization. It is not by the form of the robot. The way that people feel about those robots and the way they interact with them on a daily basis is consistent with the organizational order and not the robotic form. I also want to take a moment to talk about data sovereignty, because this has now become an explosive issue. We're seeing the European Union try to build many of their own tools to retrieve their data from the large data churning machines that are producing the LLMs at places like Google and OpenAI. And we're also seeing those companies rapaciously ingest any material on the web in order to learn from humans and produce experiences that appear to be more human-like. The main thing to take away from my study is that the way data circulates is actually important to preserving relationships as well as to doing good and responsible science. So here, data sovereignty is actually a righteous way forward. Maintaining a respect for how each group circulates and manages data is essential for upholding their mission, as well as their social relations. So for instance, I'm going to show you two pictures that are functionally equivalent. This one is on Mars, and it's the black and white version, or the grayscale, is a picture taken with the photographic cameras. And so it shows you kind of the topography of the terrain. And then the color swatches come from the thermal instrument. So it tells you the heat characteristics or heat bearing characteristics of different places. When you put those things together, you can see that places that are that look different visually also have different properties. So on the rover team, this was described as like the reason why you shouldn't ever limit yourself to one instrument. That would be foolish. Remember, this is the team that saw the robot as the Swiss Army knife and was trying constantly to come to consensus. In order to build consensus, they needed to have everybody in the room and agree to having ownership over the plan. And that meant if you were a thermal instrument person, you needed to be friends with constantly the visual instrument people. And so these kinds of visualizations, this kind of data sharing, was part of the way that the team cemented their social relations and made sure they were doing what they thought was responsible science. Meanwhile, this is exactly the same kind of image. This is of the surface of Enceladus. The grayscale is a visual picture, and the color is thermal data. And on this team, coordinate observations were considered a big political issue because in order to maintain each team's autonomy to do their work, data circulated within that team and was quite limited in terms or circumscribed in terms of how it circulated elsewhere. Now, you could think about this like data as a currency, like money. You may have a plan for sharing your wealth with your children, but not with your children's friends. And certainly not with your children's friends of friends. Many people in places that are highly independently oriented try to move to tax havens so they don't have to share their money with anyone at all. So exchanging data as a form of currency here is not just an economic artifact in that it has a certain kind of value. The value arises from its circulation among a community with relationships. And the way that it circulates marks where the relational boundaries are, as well as enables the autonomy of the team. And I remember walking through Goddard Space Flight, which is not too far from you guys, and noticing this one little computer that was abandoned in the corner. And I said to my guide, I was like, well, what's that computer for? This is a scientist who worked on this mission. And he said, oh, that computer, its only job is to call the Jet Propulsion Laboratory once a day and give it this one file. That's the only file we have to give it. And that's in our contract. So that's all that machine does. And then he winked and he said, render to Caesar only the things that are Caesar's. And so this idea that like, yeah, they are exchanging, but they're exchanging within certain kinds of parameters, and they're not giving the whole ship away. And I think this is a powerful reframing in the age of these kind of voracious AI tools that have decided that it's okay to just take, anything that's open source or anything that's open documents on the web and learn from that, regardless of how that fit into a certain community's way of doing boundary work and way of doing knowledge and way of producing value and expertise. So I wanted to spend the most time on that section of the talk. But I would like to also reveal some additional elements that I think are instructive for changing the way that we study these kinds of systems as well as build them. So the first is I'm a huge fan of on-the-box computing. In fact, during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time building my own AI virtual assistants that stayed entirely in my house and didn't talk to the cloud. And that's because I spent all this time working with robots and on other planets. They're far away. They only call home twice a day. They're not always on. They have to really carefully manage their power and their data the data that's on board. And there's no help for them, if they go down, right? They have to be entirely independently on the box. And that means we accept a lot of limitations to their capabilities, but that's okay. Their limitations become part of the thing that we're working synergistically between the humans and the robots on distant planets. I'd like to also remind you that there's no cloud and there's no genius bar in space. And you can't rely on those properties to produce the kinds of like magical, appearances that we now consider to be pretty much normal when it comes to LLMs or even talking to your Siri. Now, if any of you lived through, I don't know, the last week where Cloudflare went down and like basically the internet went down, or 2 weeks ago when AWS went down, there were so many services that were no longer functional because we have distributed intelligence or the production of what looks like intelligence across such an enormous network. And in doing so, we've weakened the resilience and the power in many ways of these tools and technologies. So I'd like to flip that script and say, if we really adopt on the box, edge computing, local computing, yeah, you accept some downgrades in terms of capabilities, but you don't need the machine to do everything, particularly given that like at CSCW, it seems like most people just use their Alexas for turning the lights on, playing music, and setting timers. That thing doesn't need to know the sum total of like all of Shakespeare. And yet we continue to kind of lazily build these systems that distribute that intelligence and capability so broadly that the machine itself is weakened and not resilient. So I'd like to think more about not only where are these capabilities distributed when we're studying them, so they're not just on the box, but they're actually distributed. And if we're building them, what can we do to build more resilience locally? Now, I am of the generation that was actually working in HCI when planned obsolescence suddenly became a thing. Planned obsolescence was not a thing beforehand. People were upgrading and managing their own machines, and if a component died, they were replacing them themselves. That's how I learned how to build computers in my living room in the 80s and 90s. And planned obsolescence came in as a phenomenon for basically ensuring continual growth for particular kinds of firms. That if you had a computer or a phone, if it died in 2 years, you would have to buy a new one, and that would ensure continuous growth and profitability. This is completely the opposite to how you would do things in space. Utterly the opposite. Because there's no genius bar in space, right? Like it's not going to fix your thing in space. Whatever you build has to last for 20, 30, or 40 years. In this case, this is the example of the interstellar probe mission. They're trying to send a robot out into the interstellar space. It's going to take them 50 years to get there. So they called a sociologist because they're like, we're all going to be dead by the time it gets there. So and as we drew it out like this, we showed not only the distance that it has to travel in space, but also the distance it had to travel in time. And that many of the people that would ultimately be in control of the spacecraft hadn't even been born yet, let alone weren't in the room. And so that's a very different kind of planning, and it's a very different kind of socio-technical orientation. You have to think much more about emulators. You have to think much more about about maintenance of old materials, and you have to think about resilience in the face of 20 to 30, 40, or 50 years in harsh conditions in space. And this means that long-term sustainability becomes the goal. Of course, we see this now on Earth with respect to the pushback against this kind of novelty that is like quickly producing machines one thing after the other, and saying it would be more sustainable if we could work with and repair what we've got, including things like the right to repair movement. But I like to take, some inspiration from the New Horizons team, which visited Pluto. They also basically were launched in the early 2000s with like the equivalent of an i46 486 processor, and they had to keep that thing alive until it got to Pluto in the 20 teens and beyond. And so one of the things they did at a certain point, when they realized that like Windows was upgrading itself and updating beyond the capability of their firmware on Earth, which had to communicate with firmware in space, they went on eBay and they bought all of this like one kind of computer built in like 1998, so that they could make sure that if one part of their ground system went down, they would swap it in with a new one. So they kind of froze in time with a certain version of operating systems and file structures so that they could continue to work with this machine. And you may have heard also the Voyager mission probes, though you still have to talk to them in Fortran 77. That's not a limitation. It's actually part of the joy. And this is the part I think we always forget. We think that novelty will always be more enchanting. And if we use top of the line, it'll seem more like the kind of thing people really like or get excited about. But there is technical excellence and challenge in keeping old technologies alive. And there's community involved in that. So it's not only that it's more sustainable, it's that it makes space for relations of care that actually do build the kinds of joyous relationships between humans and machines that we're trying to go after with novelty. So I would suggest not only do we need to think about these like attentions to distributed infrastructures that need maintenance and care, but also could that not be part of the way that we conceptualize AI and human robot systems going forward? I think often of work that was done with drone robots on the battlefield. Scholarship about how those soldiers, they didn't just want a new drone, they wanted their drone fixed. And these kinds of relations of mutual care that build up over time become far more powerful than the novelty of like it comes in rose gold. So this is largely about forthcoming work. But what's interesting about the NASA case is NASA's a not-for-profit agency. In fact, it's the original public technology organization that builds technologies for public good. And so that means, yes, they have a budget. Yes, they try to stay under budget. And in my forthcoming work, I'll explain why that doesn't always work. It's not because they're stupid and it's not because they don't know what they're doing. But the main kind of currencies that they're really working with, the thing that they have to optimize for is science. It's knowledge. How much science are we going to get out of this thing? If we're going to spend $5 billion building something that goes to the outer solar system, over 30 years, we had better make sure that it gives us the best possible science, that it inspires the public, that it creates the kinds of knowledge and technologies that suffuse the innovation ecosystem around the country. Those are the values and the currencies that drive the way that missions are constructed. So here you see a piece from behind the scenes on the Europa Clipper mission, as they're trying to say, what are our science requirements on the left? And then on the right, you see the different instruments and places where those instruments are going to contribute to those science goals. In this case, this was a chart that was used by Clipper to show that the instruments had to work interdependently in order to achieve those goals. And so this drove the way that they then designed and built the spacecraft so they could produce more interdependencies between instruments. Again, not because they thought that was cool or interesting, but because they're trying to do responsible and good science. And this is very different than what we find in the private sector, where the requirement is to produce ROI. And especially if you take venture capital, you have to produce a growth curve that's like 10x over 10 years, and it has to look like a hockey stick. I think this is best expressed in Ben Shostakovsky's new book, Behind the Startup, in which he describes an AI-driven startup in which the engineers in San Francisco are so busy trying to scale the organization by interviewing new engineers, they don't even have time to build the AI. So they outsource it to a team in the Philippines that pretends to do that all behind the scenes. And then a call center in Nevada that deals with customers who are, frustrated. And that becomes the billion-dollar unicorn. But the technology didn't even have to exist. So companies don't have the luxury of thinking about those other kinds of values and virtues. That isn't their incentive. Pictured here is the SpaceX rocket that launched Europa Clipper a year ago this fall. That isn't SpaceX's goal. Isn't to maximize the science returns. I mean, it has other kinds of goals and responsibilities to its investors, to its shareholders, and to its billionaire investor. And so what that means is different incentive structures have produced different kinds of technologies. And when we naturalize AI systems and LLMs that come from these kinds of corporate incentive structures and decisions made for scale and for ROI, we have ignored entirely different ways in which we might build, and we have naturalized their incentives as the only ones that could drive a socio-technical system. Eighth, regulation is always involved, even when it doesn't look like it is. So what's interesting about the NASA case is that regulatory oversight, government oversight, is part of the process from before the beginning. Every single one of these objects that are sent into space, they're talked about by communities of scientists. They're voted upon basically by communities of scientists. They're elaborated in conversation with government, with congressional appropriations. They must go back to Congress and show what they're doing. They have to have clear markers that indicate how expenditures relate to the kinds of science that they hope to optimize. So oversight shapes the system throughout and is an enormous part of the actual intelligences that emerge from these kinds of systems. And I would argue that this is the case even in places where regulation appears to be absent. So in studies that we did of Uber and of Amazon Flex and so on, we argue that those systems were rolled out as a form of kind of pre-automation, that those systems argued that they were basically sharing economy systems in order to generate the kind of revenue and do the kind of work behind the scenes as an ulterior motive to lay the groundwork for automation and for automated technologies like such as self-driving cars and drone delivery services. And this is an important point for companies that their goal is monopoly. Their goal is to scale to monopoly capture. This is the new form of capitalism emerging from the Valley, best embodied by Peter Thiel, who says competition is for losers. The whole point is to own the pipes. And so what's interesting here is we've developed this idea that like regulation is always behind technology and law always sort of struggles to catch up, as opposed to understanding that companies are playing a kind of cat and mouse game with government and with regulation and oversight. They're trying to become sort of chameleon-esque and say, oh, no, we're not that. We're not subject to that regulation. You have to catch up and catch us. Remember when Facebook argued that it wasn't a media company, so that it shouldn't be regulated like a media company. And the reason why evading regulation was important was to enable that kind of broad capture and monopolistic effects. And so even when the regulation isn't as intensively involved as it is in NASA, when it's pushed away or when it's being evaded, that form of evasion is still shaping the system. And it's also shaping the system when regulation is used as a cudgel, as it has been for the last basically 60 years at NASA. Dana Boyd and I have a recent piece about this, what we've seen at NASA and also at the census. And that is that it could be motivated to say that government oversight produces non-innovative technologies. It's not responsible design. In fact, it's backward and it's slow to market, it's inefficient, et cetera. And in many cases, the withdrawal of key resources from public sector technologies actually produces legitimacy threats to organizations that are trying to work responsibly. Two final points. The first is that at NASA, there are always bold plans for what our human robot future in space will look like. But the budget is never catching up to where we expect it to be. This is a chart of the budget for NASA over the past basically 60 or 70 years. And you can see that first big spike is Apollo, and then the spike falls off when Nixon decides the money needs to go to Vietnam instead of into space. And ever since then, there's been this kind of slings and arrows of outrageous fiscal fortune. What's important about this, although you could also look at this like a stock market chart, perhaps for any of your favorite stock buffering technologies today, is that we're constantly imagining that the thing we're building now isn't the thing. The thing that's coming is the thing. So what we build now has to make space for the thing that will come, because that's going to be the good thing. What we're doing with Apollo is just the beginning. Eventually, there's going to be bases on the moon. Until you've overspent so much and you haven't been able to deliver that future, that the future falls off the map. And my colleague Lisa Masseri and I call this the trajectory. It's this idea that the technology, the planned technology is always yet to come. And in discussing missions like the Mars sample return mission, we talk about how in preparation for this thing that's yet to come, that we don't yet have the resources for today, we invest resources today towards what we expect will come in the future. So for instance, the Perseverance robot was conceived of as one part of this too expensive Mars sample return mission, that it would collect samples and leave them on the surface for something else to pick up later on. But the problem is, after Perseverance and trying to build sample return, they basically ran out of money. And in many ways, through producing that first step, you get to the point where you've exhausted your resources and you actually make it impossible to go any further. And then you're stuck with a robot on Mars that has left a whole bunch of samples that you can't bring back. And I hope that the parallel to artificial AGI is very apparent here, because in this kind of eschatological, like religious fervor of if we scale fast and big enough, we can eventually get this thing, we expend so many resources along the way that we produce the conditions for its own collapse. And the problem is that then you're left with whatever was kind of halfway built, that isn't the thing that you hoped it would be. And finally, I think this is important in an era where we have ingested the world's knowledge to produce these LLMs. Those systems are not actually built around knowledge, and they don't produce knowledge, because knowledge is the production of collectives, of groups working together, in complicated conditions to try to figure out what is true, what is justified true belief. And machines can participate in that process. In fact, they often participate in that process, but they are not the sole repositories of knowledge. That is not how knowledge works, and it is certainly not how knowledge advances. And if we re-articulated these artificial intelligences as participants in the knowledge journey, along with large organizations of people oriented towards that goal, I think we would get much closer to producing the kinds of things that surpass what humans or machines could do alone. And in many ways, understanding knowledge making as a collective, a group, a human achievement is actually the most human and humanistic thing of all that we could do, regardless of whether or not machines are involved and in what capacity. So I've given you these 10 provocations that all of these machine-human interactions are always mixed autonomy, and they should be mixed autonomy. In fact, they're more interesting when they are. That machines and the way that they interact with the world and with us are entirely determined by organizational context, including how we feel about them, and including the way that we want to circulate data with and about them. I've argued that NASA gives us new ways to think about on-the-box computing as opposed to as resilient as opposed to this kind of distributed magic box kind of phenomenon that's actually weak and fragile, that we should be planning against obsolescence in many ways to produce stronger human robot interactions and relations, that there are different economic principles that can guide the production of these machines. And in doing so, if we're not paying attention to that, we run the risk of naturalizing one form of economic structure over another, that regulation is always shaping the system, whether you're evading it or not, that the future is never the thing that ends up actually coming, even though it's the thing that determines what you build now, and that we should reconceptualize knowledge as collective achievement and not as as an object that's embodied in singular bodies, whether human or machine. And what that means is when we go back to thinking about AI and LLMs and robots, the kinds of imaginaries we have now are cautious. In fact, they're not only are they not the only way of doing things, they're really limiting for the kinds of things that we might build and the kinds of machine-human interfaces that we might experience and enjoy in the future. And hopefully what I've given you today is some ways of thinking about these interpolations that leave us in a far more human place. So I'm going to stop there and welcome any and all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Vertesi, for that wonderful presentation. We'll now open it up for questions. The audience can unmute to ask questions or post questions in the chat or Q&A sections. And for the sake of recordings, I will read your questions as they come in and post them to our speakers. So if you have any questions, you can unmute, or you can just type in the chat or in the Q&A.
Oh, and now I can see the attendees. Excellent. Hello, thank you for coming and listening. And I want to hear what you have to say, except for the Otter chatbot. I don't really care what the Otter has to say.
I have a question. This is Noel.
Hi,
Can
Noel.
you talk about you kind of touched on this, the social, emotional, cultural, and relational aspects of AI human teaming, and how I know you mentioned the different cultures and the different teams, but maybe across cultures like European or East Asian space agencies versus and NASA, things like that.
Yeah, sure. So there's a kind of local culture with machines that influences how they're built, and then there's a kind of more broader culture, maybe with a capital C, as opposed to the organizational culture with a lowercase. My colleague Selma Savadovich over at Indiana does a great comparison between the US context and Japanese context. And actually another colleague of mine who's now in anthropology at Harvard has been looking at this as well, in particular how in the US context, are not trusted as part of so they're seen as threatening, whereas in Japan they're seen as collaborative and friendly. And so those differences may also determine the kinds of things that we build and the relationships that we build with them. I think what's cool about the NASA case though is the team that works with the robots is largely kind of the team that builds the robots, so they get to build the thing that they want to see in the world. And so they end up building and reifying their own culture in the object itself. And it's very difficult to break away from that. I can't really imagine another way of working with those machines because of the organizational work that's laid those lines down. It's very Latourian, and the idea that the technology becomes the society made durable, and it just continues to reproduce itself through the robot, the ground systems, and the organizational culture year after year after year. So certainly for the Cassini mission to Saturn, which was a large US and European collaboration, there wasn't anything I could point to that was distinct about how the Europeans dealt with the robot. But the fact that it was an ESA and NASA collaboration in a certain kind of way built that sense of the autonomy of different kinds of teams to make their own decisions in a way that was perhaps more pronounced than in other kinds of places. Thanks. I see Ben has his hand up. I can allow you to talk. Go for it.
Hi, Janet. Thank you for an exceptional talk. That was really quite wonderful.
Thanks.
And really a lot of helpful ideas. My question is about the transfer, your experience in studying these teams. You mentioned LLM design, And I wonder what you can tell us what you think are the implications for design for
Mhm.
LLMs and ChatGPT. Particularly, I think the anthropomorphic deception is a real problem. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. Um, I think we have built these LLMs for interpersonal, like one-to-one interaction. And the way that we think about whether or not they're powerful is if they're like helping us specifically. And then we run into all kinds of problems with like, oh, these people, this person is thinks that the LLM is their lover, or this person is, being convinced to commit suicide because we're thinking about dyadic interactions. That's the realm of psychology. It's not really the realm of sociology. But there's a number of things that we've completely tripped over that should have been obvious to anybody in advance. That in building these machines as kind of personal sidekicks, especially with the sycophancy built in, that makes us continue to use the system so they get return on investment means that we're trapped in a certain mechanism of interaction. I think, in terms of implications for design, why aren't we building the kinds of, whether it's chatbots or machines, that support different organizations or groups in configuration? Instead of thinking about the individual, the kind of one-to-one, the robot sidekick, if we're really thinking about team dynamics, it gives us a whole different set of repertoires to be working with and across. And it means that certain kinds of things that we've implemented, like Copilot, just rolled out across like the whole Office 365 experience. I just opened a Word document the other day and it was basically like Clippy. It was like, looks like you're writing a letter. Do you want to make it more formal? And I was like, Clippy, no. Because in fact, I don't need that LLM in that context. I'm doing a group collaborative effort. I was writing a paper with 6 other co-authors. The last thing I want is some random, like, neutrality machine coming in from, somewhere else to make it more readable, as opposed to like, no, this has to have a specific vocabulary for this audience. It's come from this community. What if we built tools like that? What if we built tools that were more conscientious of that? We wouldn't have this kind of like chatbot convincing you to, commit suicide or change your job or leave your wife. We would have the kinds of machines that were supporting group interactions and communication in a more powerful way. So that's the kind of thing I get more excited about when it comes to LLMs. Not how perfectly do they speak, not how much do I like mine, but how do they support group work? And I'm willing to
Very
take
nice.
all kinds of limitations to make that better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I had seen some other hands. Are you taking track, Steve?
Yes, I'm taking track of the chat.
Mhm.
Simran asking why is relying on magic box AI systems considered risky, and how can we design better ones?
So the magic box thing is like that whatever looks like it's on the box is actually off the box and it's distributed. And then it's reliant on a whole series of other infrastructures that you don't really control. So it's like when you try to use Siri and you're not on the internet, Siri basically can't do very much, right? And some of that has to do with the limitations of chips largely. So I remember when Alexa's first came out, it was like we can't fit the world in the box. So we're going to make the box talk to the world. And that's going to give the box way more capabilities. But when you build these robots that go out into space, they can't talk to the world. There's no interplanetary internet. I mean, there is, but the interplanetary internet is like slow. It's packet by packet. It's highly interrupted and interruptible. It is sceneful out the wazoo. And what I love about that is it gives us so many provocations for design that takes scenefulness as a site of resilience. It allows us to say, okay, if you can only talk to the internet twice a day, how are you managing what communications and what things are happening on the box? And, watching things like AWS go down 3 weeks ago and like basically the internet broke. We put so much reliance in corporations, not just because of the products that they're producing and the webs of relationships that they're producing, but they're trying to get to that kind of market capture, monopoly capture. So it's in their interest to make it such that we have to rely on their pipes. And the problem there is that when those things go down, or when they change their terms of service or whatever, we're left with an object that basically breaks. Think of the people who now have those robot vacuums that once they want to preserve their privacy in the house, like maybe they don't want the vacuum taking pictures of them naked on the way to the shower. And so they disconnect it and then the vacuum breaks. And then you have no option. I think it's so much more interesting to design systems that try to contain the world in the box, on the box. And if the world doesn't fit in the box, it doesn't all need to be there. And that's what's so cool about these robots. These robots don't have a ton of onboard capability. The robots on Mars, like they know if they're going to drive off a cliff, they shouldn't. And they know that if they drive up to a rock and there's a rock in the way and it's going to like really trip them up, they should go around it and then keep going. And sometimes they keep going in the same direction and sometimes they keep going in the wrong direction. But like they're trying to just not die. And that's fine. That's like all they need in order for us to still have really rich relationships and human robot partnerships to do incredible science with them. So I think that when we stop thinking about this box has to do it all, and to do it all, it has to be connected to the whole network, and it has to be connected to these corporate networks and machines that are oriented towards monopoly, and that's natural. And we start thinking about what does it look like to make sort of singular instances on the box constrained. People will still have powerful relationships with these machineries, but they become more resilient and they become less risky and they don't tie us to our corporate overlords. I hope that helps. And I see also something from Sarah James. Is that right? Should I take these questions next? What do you think?
Well, actually at time, but if
okay.
Yeah, if you want to stay longer answering this question, that's totally fine.
Sure. Well, let me try to take them really quickly. Mixed autonomy and the pain points in the way we describe AI impact in high science fields. Why are narratives being prevented to go deep into the more dynamic nature? I think so. Why do we configure AI knowledge so limitedly? So I think what's interesting about mixed autonomy and the limited configuration is that we assume that these robots should be autonomous. We think of them as like C-3PO and R2-D2. There's only one moment in the entire Star Wars series where like Luke plugs R2-D2 in for power, right? But like robots always need more help than that. They always need, they're dependent on power, they're dependent on, programming, they're dependent on like not getting, rust in their joints or sand in the joints. Like there's a lot of things that robots need help for. And I actually think the times that we're interdependent make for stronger social relations. We tend to think of ourselves as well as our robots as independent, like grains of sand out there. And actually, it's our interdependencies that make us human. It's our interdependencies that give us agency and that give us hope and that give us new opportunities. I think Latour describes this in actor network theory, which is very poorly understood more generally, but like we don't act alone. We always act in collaboration and in coordination. And so trying to like limit the ways in which machinery is dependent on people is, I think, a problem for thinking about how we might work more in a more exciting and dynamic way with machines. There are many machines that I bring into my life that I have long-standing care relationships with, my Linux phone, my Pebble smartwatch, that I keep alive years and years after they're basically deprecated, with communities of people all over the world that are also like rescripting the firmware and trying to make sure that we can live with these tools together in a responsible way. And it's produced an entirely different set of socio-technical relationships that are often not understandable to my friends who live with more of the corporate machinery. They think, oh, you must not like technology. And I'm like, no, actually, I love technology and I love my tools because they are thickly interwoven with my life and they bring me into contact with communities of care and meaning. And so I think once we start getting away from this kind of idea that the robots are autonomous and that we're autonomous, and start thinking of these systems in a much more mixed, dynamic, interactional way. I think organizational sociology gives us a way to do that, but there's other tools as well. We end up bringing out these much more exciting possibilities for what our futures could be in science and then just in life more generally. So there we go. And I realize we're at time, but thank you all. I'm really excited to hear more from you. Feel free to write to me. I will put my email in the chat and I will say thank you so much. to see and to everybody involved for bringing me, and I'm delighted to continue to talk further.
Yes, thank you, Professor Vertesi, and thank you for everyone for coming. And once again, to our wonderful speakers, Professor Janet Vertesi as well. This is our final speaker series for this year. Please check out our website, which we'll just put in our chat to see more about us. And I wish all of you a great Thanksgiving holiday next week. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.